Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Taking Up Space with Jordan. I'm your host, Jordan. And today we are going to be talking about something that I actually want to give a trigger warning for. Today we are going to talk about the idea of grief and specifically grieving a parent that is no longer in your life. They're fully alive. They're just no longer in your life anymore. And so with it being, this episode is going to be coming out on Father's Day. And I was really battling between whether or not to release something like this or whether to talk about ADHD or something like that, which is something that I do want to talk about. But it is something that wouldn't leave my brain. And that's why I wanted to kind of come on this space, because as somebody who was rejected by two father figures, I had a biological father that was not in my life from like basically days before I was born. And then I had a stepfather figure who came in my life when I was young and just really wasn't suitable for the role. And unfortunately, a lot of damage happened to my, mental psyche of having that relationship in my life until eventually I decided to not have that relationship. And so I basically wanted to talk about grief from the point of view of somebody who feels like they're on the other side of it. It's more kind of like an open letter to anybody who is maybe starting the grief journey this weekend, or maybe they just need to hear these words to let them know that it's going to be okay if they decide to cut off a parent. These are words that I think that I needed back then to let me know that it was going to be okay. So if you are interested in this episode, keep on listening. It's going to be a little bit of a heavy one. So this is your warning. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Before we really dive into it, I do want to acknowledge something that I think is incredibly important, which is that everyone's situation is going to be different. Some people have lost parents to death. Some have incredible relationships with their parents. Some are actively trying to repair a relationship. And some of us are carrying around a grief that feels impossible to explain because technically the person is still here. They're alive. They have a phone number. You could theoretically call them, but they're no longer in your life. And somehow that grief can feel even more complicated because when someone dies, people understand why you're grieving. There are rituals, there are condolences, there is space made for your pain. When someone is alive but absent, people don't always understand. They ask questions like, have you tried talking to them? Maybe they're doing their best, but that's still your parent. That's still your mom. That's still your dad. And suddenly you're expected to defend your grief instead of simply feeling it. For a long time, I didn't realize that I was grieving. I thought I was angry. I thought I was frustrated. I thought I was healing. And maybe all of those things were and are true. But underneath all of it was grief. But at some point, I had to accept that the relationship I wanted wasn't the relationship I had. And those are two very different things. I think one of the hardest parts about growing up is realizing that some people are never going to become who you need them to be. Not because you didn't explain it correctly, not because you didn't try hard enough, not because you weren't lovable enough, but because they either can't or won't meet you where you are. And that realization hurts because most of us spend years believing that if we say the right thing, heal enough, become successful enough, become understanding enough, that maybe this person will finally show up for us the way that we've always needed. Maybe this holiday will be different. Maybe this conversation will be different. Maybe this birthday will be different. Maybe this time they'll choose me. And eventually you have to grieve not only the parent you had, but for the parent that you hoped for, the parent that you deserved, the parent you kept waiting for. And I think that's the part that broke my heart the most, is not losing who they were, not losing who I wanted them to be, but because hope can be beautiful, but hope can also keep us stuck. It can keep us returning to the same door over and over again, expecting a different answer. And there comes a point where protecting your peace requires accepting reality, not the potential, not the promise, not the version of them that you've created in your head, but reality. And acceptance is not the same thing as approval. And I want to say that again because someone needs to hear that. Acceptance is not approval. Accepting that someone hurt you does not mean it was okay. Accepting that someone cannot give you what you need does not mean that they are right. Accepting that a relationship is unhealthy does not mean you wanted it to end. It simply means you're choosing reality over fantasy. And that is incredibly painful. I remember feeling guilty for grieving someone who wasn't dead. I felt like I was dramatic, ungrateful, selfish, like maybe I should just get over it. But grief doesn't care about technicalities. Grief is simply love that has nowhere to go. It's mourning a relationship, a future, a possibility, a dream. And if you've had to create distance from a parent, whether that means low contact, no contact, or simply emotionally letting go of expectations, there is grief in that. There is sadness in that, and there is loss in that. And you don't need anyone else's permission to acknowledge it. One thing I've learned is that healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes healing looks like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like rebuilding. But sometimes healing looks like creating a beautiful life anyway. Sometimes healing looks like stopping the chase, stopping the begging, stopping the endless audition for someone's love, and deciding that your worth is not determined by whether they choose you. Because here's what I wish someone had told me sooner. The absence of a parent's love is not evidence that you are unlovable. The absence of a parent's support is not evidence that you are not worthy. And the absence of a parent's approval is not evidence that you are failing. It is evidence that they are a human being with limitations. And while that may explain their behavior, it does not erase the impact that it had on you. Both of those things can be true. You can understand someone and still be hurt by them. You can love someone and still need distance. You can wish them well and still not invite them back into your life. You can grieve them and still know that you made the right decision. Those things are not contradictions. They're part of being a human being. And if you're listening to this carrying that kind of grief, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are so many of us walking around carrying these invisible losses. Relationships we had to leave behind, parents we had to stop waiting for, versions of family that we never got to have. And while I wish none of us understood this pain, and there is comfort in knowing that we are not the only ones experiencing it, so if today is a hard day, just let it be a hard day. If you need to cry, cry. If you need to journal, journal. If you need to go for a walk and let yourself feel angry, do that too. But please stop telling yourself that your grief isn't valid simply because the person is still alive. Grief is grief. And your heart knows the difference between what exists and what should have existed. This was a short but kind of more of like an open letter and reminder to anybody out there that is running away from today or any of these types of holidays where it's central around a parental figure of any sort. And so I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time with me today. As always, my hope is that this podcast reminds you that you're allowed to take up space even when you're grieving, even when you're healing, and even when you're rebuilding a life that looks different than the one you originally imagined. I'll talk to you next week. Kisses.